Galatians 4 through 6. A good reminder for interpreting Galatians in light of the larger story of the Bible is to remember it's right during that period of Acts 15, and also it's written to Gentiles. This is to Galatia, an area that's largely Gentile. So let's review. We have a gospel that Peter is preaching. We talked about it in Acts 15. It would be the idea that Jews are, of course, worshiping a believing Jew, would be in Paul or in Peter's gospel, shall we call it. A Jew will worship Yahweh. He will also worship Jesus as the fulfillment of Torah. So in that sense, they would call themselves being under Torah, not in the legalistic sense of fulfilling, little aspects of ritual law. No, it's just that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Torah promised. He is the Son of Man of Daniel 7. He's the Messiah figure of numerous passages. He's the shepherd figure of Ezekiel 34, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, the messenger of Malachi 3, the royal leader of Psalm 110. In other words, everything that Jesus is found within, through Torah. So the people, again, this is Peter's gospel, that as you believe in Jesus, you Jews, you stick with Torah. So I think the question of asking a Jew, why do you keep following Torah, or why do you still consider yourself a Jew, even though you are a believer in Jesus, that question itself would be surprising to a Jew. They would say, of course I'm Jewish, and I'm going to stay Jewish. I'm going to stay under Torah because Jesus is the ultimate Jew. Okay, that's what Peter was preaching. That's why it's so very different from the gospel that Paul was preaching to Gentiles. We learn in Galatians 4:3 that Paul, as he talks about the past of the Gentile, they lived under what he calls the enslavement of stoicheia, is the Greek word. It occurs several times in Paul's letters. It's the astral gods of the Roman Empire. We've known these as Elohim in the Old Testament, Theos or Theoi in the New Testament, Daimonia in Jesus' gospel, or in the Gospels that Jesus is casting them out. These are the gods of the Old Testament. We're fulfilling again that story that comes all the way through, where they were put under Genesis 11. The Gentile nations followed the dictates of created gods. And so, thou shalt have no other gods before me. They knew they were not to follow the stoicheia of the world. Galatians 4:3. Even so we, when we were children, he's speaking editorial we in the sense that Paul is identifying with the Gentiles as their apostle. We, when we were children, were enslaved by the stoicheia of the world, these gods. Now, watch what happens. This is really the theme of Galatians in a verse. But when the fullness of time had come, verses 4 and 5, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, born under the law. He is going to be following as the consummate Jew. This is Jesus before, of course, he ascends. He is the consummate Jew who follows Torah, and he believes in the God of Torah. So he's under the law. Watch how the verse unpacks, to redeem or deliver. So he's going to deliver those who are under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. Why does Jesus come? Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but in this verse, he comes for two reasons. He comes to deliver the Jews and to adopt the Gentiles. The word adoption is used 5 times in Paul's letters, only in Paul's letters in the New Testament, and each of those 5 is written to and about Gentiles. So it's a story, again, of how someone who is outside the family is now becoming part of the family. The story in full, then, I love Galatians 4:7. Therefore you are no longer a slave to those gods, but a son, and if a son, an heir. And there you see them joining this family that had the privilege, the promise of resurrection, but an heir of God through Christ. But Paul is nervous. In 4:20 he says, I have doubts about you. And this again forms so much of the book of Galatians. 4:21, you who desire to be under law, do you not hear the law? Here's what's going on. Gentiles are becoming worshipers not of stoicheia. They are breaking their relationship. This would be the Philippian jailer Lydia, whatever, they break their relationship with the gods they're worshiping in Rome, and they worship Jesus and God. And as he says, you who desire to be under the law, then they think, well, if I'm going to do that, these people who worship Jesus and Yahweh, they're under Torah, so I'm going to go over there and I'm going to follow Torah as well. There's the problem. The Gospel of Paul says you get to have Jesus and Yahweh and only them. You do not need to go under Torah. The Gospel of Peter said follow Torah because you're a Jew. Here's the problem. And you can hear it in 4:21 when he says, do you hear the law? Paul is saying, if you read the law, guys, Gentiles, you got a problem, because the Gentiles are cursed from the very beginning. Remember how back in Genesis 12, verse 3, very early on, of course, right in the story of Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Built into Torah is the idea that Gentiles are a cursed nation, anyone outside of the family. So Paul is simply saying the curse of the law is being a Gentile. It's not a performance issue. Nowhere in the Old Testament does it say you have to keep all the laws perfectly. David loved the law. We read it in the Psalms, and yet he was a good breaker of the law, as we know. So the curse of the law is not the perfection demanded by it. That's a very terrible rumor that has started throughout the Christian tradition. The curse of the law is simply being a Gentile. It's not a performance issue. It's an identity issue. And Paul is saying, you've got a choice, guys. If you want Jesus and be favored by Jesus, remember how grace is used in the book of Galatians. If you want to be favored by Jesus, then don't try to go toward the law. You're going to have to choose. That comes out, I think, as we have it in 5:4. You have become estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by the law. You have fallen from Jesus' offer of favor. And again, being careful with the words of Paul. This is where we have to be careful in the concept of a substitutionary death. This is in 3. Go back to 3 to get this. Chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. Christ became a curse for us. When Jesus died on the cross, he somehow took upon himself this curse. But notice what the substitution does. So that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in Jesus Christ. The substitutionary death of Jesus is part of the biblical story, but it's very specific. It has nothing to do with going from hell to heaven, but more from being a cursed Gentile to an adoptee into the family of Abraham. Well, we end with just today, we're going to have a lot of opportunity to talk about this later as we go through Paul's letters, but he's got these long lists of virtues and vices. 5:19 through 23. The works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, and so forth. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering. The reason for these vice and virtue lists, and again, we'll talk about these later, is not for modern preachers to be able to just point their finger through the audience and say, shape up. It's because, think of this, Gentiles had never associated morality with their gods. The gods were terribly immoral. So when I worshipped a deity, I never thought of being good because of my deity. And yet when a Gentile comes to faith in Yahweh and Jesus, they need to be taught by Paul that the God of Israel is very moral. He's very interested in how humans treat each other, especially relationally. And that's why many of these terms that we even see in Galatians are relational. So for people who are not familiar with the concept of a moral deity, that's why we're going to have these lists. And so be ready in Paul to have some very elemental teaching on the issues of right and wrong as a Christian Gentile, because again, it's something they were not familiar with.